The U.S. Navy has gone through some dramatic changes during its 200-year existence. From the commerce raiders of the American Revolution to the mightiest military instrument afloat in the Second World War, the U.S. Navy has proven its ability to adapt to changing times. The war in Vietnam was no exception. Facing a foe that lacked all but the most rudimentary naval force, the Navy was called upon to meet many different challenges in a very complex environment. The story of the U.S. Navy in the Vietnam War is an important part of the wider saga of American involvement in Southeast Asia. When the U.S. military began its involvement in Vietnam during the 1950s, it was realized that the best means of carrying cargo and people in many parts of the country was by water. This was something the Viet Cong took full advantage of. U.S. Navy personnel worked with the South Vietnamese Navy along the coast and in the Mekong Delta, where they trained their Vietnamese counterparts in how to regulate coastal and river traffic. At the same time, the ships of the Blue Water Navy were involved in surveillance and electronic snooping off the North Vietnamese coast. It was here in international waters that direct conflict with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or the DRV, began. On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox was attacked by 3 North Vietnamese patrol boats. The Maddox sank one of the attackers while the others were driven off by aircraft from a nearby American carrier. Although not known to the American public at the time, the U.S. destroyer was sailing near the site of a South Vietnamese naval raid against the DRV, which provoked the North Vietnamese response. A second attack was reported to have occurred 2 days later against the Maddox and the USS Turner Joy, a second destroyer that had joined her. It was a stormy night, and there is considerable doubt that an attack actually occurred.
What they thought was a radar blip showing torpedo boats coming out to attack them. In retrospect, this one officer, and I think he was in CIC at the time, said he really thought it was sea return, which if you know radar, with surface radar, sometimes if the sea state has built up swells and so on, that can send a radar return back that to some operators that might not be that skilled might look like a surface ship, but it's not.
President Johnson used this second attack, known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, as a pretext to launch airstrikes against the North. He ordered his aircraft carriers into action. America officially entered the war in Vietnam on August 7, 1964, with Operation Pierce Arrow, a series of reprisal strikes against North Vietnamese naval bases and support facilities. The operation marked the beginning of a prolonged involvement by the U.S. Navy in the fighting in Southeast Asia. Cruising off the coast of what became known as Yankee Station, the aircraft carrier battle groups became to many the symbol of the U.S. Navy in Vietnam. This was the part of naval operations in Vietnam that received the most publicity and was best understood by the American public. Involved from the very beginning of open conflict, by March of 1965, daily air operations were being conducted against targets in both South and North Vietnam.
During this initial air campaign, the airstrikes that are being carried out in the South are designed to support the ground troops and those that are in direct combat with the insurgents. While the strikes that are going in against the North, they're designed as a club or a way to persuade the North Vietnamese to stop their support of the insurgency being carried out in the South.
Interdiction of troops and supplies bound for the South became part of this campaign. However, in the North, this was a carefully controlled war, and Only those locations on the target lists approved by Washington could be attacked.
And we didn't strike any targets or launch any aircraft until we got approval, except some very low-level targets of opportunity, like we'd find a truck, Army truck on the road or something. We were authorized to strike that. But POL dumps and transportation centers, hubs, we didn't strike those without their approval.
Always lurking in the background was the possibility of a wider war. It was only a few years since the Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the world to the very edge of nuclear annihilation, and it was felt that the Soviet Union and/or China might actively participate if provoked. Avoiding that provocation became paramount and served to limit the scope of the naval airstrikes. Yet even as the international chess game was being played out, operations at Yankee Station built to a crescendo of activity.
In the first 4 months I had commanded the ship, I had over 10,000 combat landings, which gives you an idea of the tempo of operations there.
This was not a strategic bombing campaign. We were busting bridges and highways, fuel dumps in the jungles, boats on the river. We were not allowed to strike in the big urban industrial areas like Haiphong or Hanoi or Hangzhou, because the Russians kept the duty merchant ship in port at all times, and we weren't allowed to strike any Soviet equipment.
But in spite of restrictions, civilian targets were inevitably hit, and heavy casualties inflicted on the population. This was a major cause of criticism of U.S. policy, both at home and abroad. But in spite of criticism, Johnson was not about to curtail airstrikes against the North. The carriers and their planes, along with the Air Force, became Washington's bargaining tool with the North Vietnamese. Carrier strikes were used by Washington in an attempt to force the other side to accept its bargaining position, and would continue throughout the war, culminating with an all-out campaign in December of 1972 to force the North Vietnamese and the National Liberation Front to accept U.S. conditions for withdrawal from the South. But that was years in the future, and from 1965 through 1971, aircraft continued to scream off the decks of carriers on Yankee Station and turn toward the hostile coast of Vietnam. Military operations in wartime are by their very nature dangerous. Even though the North Vietnamese could not seriously threaten U.S. warships sailing off the coast, the threat of attack could not be totally disregarded.
You would have to say that there's certainly a difference in the level of intensity that members of ship's company felt. There was only one time where I remember that we actually went to general quarters, and that was because we had gone quite far up into the Gulf of Tonkin, and there was concern that, well, maybe the North Vietnamese might try to send some airplanes out and attack us. Generally speaking, we were operating in what was considered a safe area as far as the ships were concerned. Now, of course, for the pilots, whenever they left the ship on an operation flying over Vietnam, they were going into combat, and it was always a life or death situation for them. They never knew if that day their number might be up.
When the naval airstrikes began in the wake of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, they went in against fairly weak air defenses. However, the North Vietnamese soon established a formidable air defense system built around Soviet-made anti-aircraft guns, surface-to-air missiles, and MiG interceptors. Jumps and starts in the bombing raids, well-defined strike areas, as well as continued Soviet and Chinese support with increasingly sophisticated weapons, made the density of anti-aircraft fire over North Vietnam some of the worst ever encountered.
The SAMs that they had at that time were not terribly sophisticated. They could vary their detonation by proximity, which they did. And the one strike that I did lead in, they were after me. They pick the leader out, shoot at him. But our tactic for that at that time was to climb in a turn, always in a turn. And I look back over at my shoulder, and there he goes, about probably 100 yards from me, I guess. Why it missed me, I have no idea, but they missed. They were lousy shots.
In about a 6-week period on the Shard, I lost 21 aircraft. And we left 12 pilots up in Hanoi in the POWs, as up in the Hanoi Hilton, as they called it.
As losses mounted, Navy search and rescue efforts became more refined, and it wasn't long before rescue helicopters were being stationed on picket destroyers close to the coast.
Typically we had a DLG, which is the destroyer-guided, light-guided. It's a little bit larger frame, and it has more of a fantail to put the aircraft down, but there was so much junk back there that the junk, and anybody who's surface Navy is going to recoil at that one, but there was so much stuff back there to land on. When we landed our H-2 on the back of a destroyer, we had to have our door gunner, or our crewman, laying on his belly in a gunner's belt so they wouldn't fall out, watching our tail rotor to see that we were over the deck edge, because we only had like 2 or 3 feet in which that tail wheel would sit down. We had spots painted on the main deck where the main frames would go, and that left our rotor system probably about 5 feet to 8 feet from a missile launcher.
If it was dangerous in the skies for fast-moving jets, it was beyond perilous for the crews of the helicopters sent in to try and extract downed pilots from an aroused and hostile defense.
We had a rescue combat air patrol who was giving us vectors and steers overhead. We had a man air traffic controller on board the ship who had taken the Mayday call from the F-4 crew. And by the way, I should say my crewmen were Don West and Bruce Dallas. So we were trying to get a lock on to the survivors. And they were in such a dense jungle. Now, to get into this jungle, they tell us that they had to do a concerted hit the vines like a tackling dummy, like a football tackling dummy, and they could make a few inches. And Zeke, when he ejected out of the seat, broke his ankle and broke his leg. I mean, it's amazing how he was able to do any of this. So we found their position where we got right on top of them. We could see the strobe light now. Bruce Dallas is the cable operator. He's running it out. He can see the survivors on the ground. They are probably less than 10 feet away from where the cable was, and they can't get to it because of the density of the jungle and the vines. And we're holding this hover because we have the parachute flares and we can see trees and everything. Then the parachute flares burned out. I had no visual horizon, and we're down among trees, and Clyde starts climbing out, and on the way out we hit a tree. It grabs a hold of the helicopter. We pitched nose down to the left. I can remember this because I can see the branches coming up. Bruce Dallas gets hit in the face by the limb of the tree that we hit, and don't know how, but we flew out of there. We tell him on the ground, we can't do that. I mean, you were 10 feet away and you couldn't get to it. We can't hold that hover. They kept saying, no, you have to come get us. We can't come down. And I remember telling on the radio, I said, we can't come get you, and if you can't come down, then you're staying there tonight. I said, we'll make it. We'll be there. Now, all of this light and all of the noise and everything, and there's probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 villages that I can remember, but we see people stumbling across the dikes of the rice paddy in the parachute flares, and they're shooting at us. And Bruce Dallas was shooting back with the M60 to try and slow him down a little bit, and Don West and I were watching the jungle. And about this time, we saw 2 figures burst out of the jungle and start running towards us. And I told Don, I said, you watch him. If you see a muzzle flash, you start shooting. And fortunately, it was Claw and Burns. And even though Zeke Burns had the broken ankle, he beat Claw to the aircraft. And the signal was that anytime for the air crewman to tell the pilot that they were ready to leave, that the survivors were on board, was to tap the pilot on the shoulder. Well, Clyde said Bruce almost knocked him out of the seat, even though he was strapped in. So there we go. We took off, and the only way to the ship was in a straight line right across some heavy anti-aircraft artillery, shore batteries again. And so as we crossed the beach line, I could see down with the lights of Vin to the south of us, I could see a little bit of a horizon in the haze, and it looked like somebody had taken a bunch of flaming arrows and threw it at us. And there was a bit of a horizon, and any pilot who flies knows that if it's on the horizon, it's at your level. And so I scared Clyde for the second time that night, and I screamed at him, "Get down," and I hit the collective, and we dropped about 500 feet in 5 seconds, and whatever it was that was sent up at us burst probably a mile, a half mile, a quarter mile away. So it didn't, and then we got back up, and as we said, we made an uneventful landing. Clyde did an excellent job. We landed with somewhere between 5 and 8 minutes of fuel in the tank, indicated. Never once were we hit. All that shooting, we were never hit.
Not all these hair-raising missions ended so successfully, and sometimes the crews of the SAR helicopters fell victim to the ever more sophisticated North Vietnamese air defense network. As airstrikes against the North grew in number and intensity, it became apparent that carrier strikes alone could not save the South Vietnamese government. Using a series of attacks on American advisors and support facilities in South Vietnam as justification, President Johnson committed U.S. ground forces to the widening war. Naval operations then added another phase, the transportation and landing of American combat troops. On the 8th of March, 1965, the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade was landed near Da Nang, the first large U.S. combat unit into the Republic of Vietnam.
When the Marines finally were sent ashore, we were using the old World War II LCVP flat-bottom boats with the bow ramps that come down in the surf. They didn't know if it'd be opposed or not. I guess the intelligence wasn't all that great. Well, it turned out it was not opposed.
Their arrival helped shore up the position of the South Vietnamese government, but their presence alone was not enough. America rapidly became more directly involved in prosecuting the war, and as it did, the U.S. Navy's role of transportation and supplying the new forces became increasingly important. As American forces went from 20,000 to 500,000, it became obvious that they could not be sustained by over-the-beach supply operations. Port facilities sprang up almost overnight to support the expanding American military presence in South Vietnam. These facilities and the supply ships they harbored became the targets of repeated enemy attacks.
We were sitting at anchor in Vietnam. I can't even remember the name of the town now. And every evening, I'd take my cup of coffee and go out on the boat deck, and I could see the tracers bouncing back and forth over on the beach. But this one evening, I went out with my coffee, and all of a sudden, these tracers are coming towards the ship. Well, I guess the old man saw them too at the same time. We couldn't get out of there fast enough. Went back to Subic Bay, at Naval Base, discharged the napalm. I sent a radiogram to San Francisco, told them I quit. That enough's enough. 3 wars, to hell with it.
Out of necessity, the U.S. Navy established harbor commands, which monitored all traffic into and out of an anchorage 24 hours a day. The command center had at its disposal roving patrol boats that could be dispatched by radio to check any vessel. The Navy adapted civilian watercraft to undertake the new mission. Adding weapons and some armor, the Navy turned a supply cutter into what became known as the Swift boat. Capable of speeds up to 25 knots and armed with 50 caliber machine guns and an 81 millimeter mortar, Swift boats could move rapidly to intercept any suspicious craft. The tedium of boarding and checking vessels, most of which were harmless, could become terror in just seconds. Vigilance was essential for one never knew when an enemy craft might be encountered. To back up the swift boat's efforts, smaller Navy boats patrolled among the anchored ships in the harbor, watching for enemy swimmers or unusual activity. Periodically, they were joined by Navy swimmers who would check the anchored ships for charges planted by an active and wily enemy. But the hazards for supply ships were not all found in the harbors, especially if they were headed for Saigon. These ships, lying peacefully in the coastal anchorage near Vung Tau, still had to reach Saigon to be unloaded. To get there, the merchant ships had to navigate a narrow channel that snaked its way through the Rung Sat, a 400-square-mile area of small channels and mangrove swamps that had long been a Viet Cong sanctuary.
I commanded a little 500-person task force in the Rung Sat zone, which was the area south of Saigon, where the mangrove swamps were located, and I had PBRs and smaller boats and infantrymen and both Navy and Air Force aircraft available to me to this little task force, and our job was to go into the mangrove swamps and to find where their headquarters were and then eliminate them.
The narrow channel through the Rung Sat, formed by the Long Tau River Delta, was some 45 miles long and gave the enemy a unique opportunity. One large ship sunk by a mine would stop the flow of virtually all vessels and supplies into Saigon. To prevent this possibility, minesweepers, or MSBs, 57 feet long and wooden hulled, were called upon to find and disable enemy mines in the river. Arriving at their patrol area, the 6-man crew would deploy their specialized minesweeping gear. Floats dragged a cable behind the boat with special cutter blades attached that were designed to cut any control or mooring cables on mines planted in the channel. Once the minesweeping equipment had been set, the crew would settle into what was normally a dull routine, keeping watch, manning the guns, and resetting the sweeping gear. MSBs operated as a team, with one boat in the lead and the next staggered back and sweeping further out. It could be dangerous work. In addition to the danger from the mines they searched for, the channel often passed only a few yards from the riverbank. The routine could be suddenly broken by enemy fire.
There was action, but I wouldn't say that there was a lot of action. Probably my worst experience was coming close to getting hit by a B-40 rocket that was launched from somewhere. And it had my name on it, but it missed me. And that was, but that didn't seem like a horrible experience. I mean, it was just kind of this, it happened so quickly, and then I kind of went, wow, all right, I'm still here.
The minesweeping went on until dark, when the MSBs would dock in the inky blackness of a humid Southeast Asian night, a time when the enemy was most likely to strike. The Navy's response could come with unexpected suddenness from the ships cruising in the waters offshore. When American troops were committed to combat in the coastal areas of South Vietnam, the destroyers and cruisers of the 7th Fleet began prowling the coastal waters of Vietnam, firing on targets identified by aerial or ground observers. However it was called, the fire could be devastating to the enemy and often made the difference in life and death for beleaguered American units. As with other portions of the mission in Vietnam, the U.S. Navy had to scramble to find adequate ways to fulfill the growing requirements for gunfire support in Southeast Asia. A partial response was to recommission and refurbish World War II-era vessels. Outfitted with conventional gun mounts and quick-firing auto-loading rocket launchers, they could rapidly respond to a request for support. As effective as these classes of ships were, there was a need for longer range and increased hitting power. This brought about the return of the battleship to the fleet's arsenal. Soon they were firing their massive 16-inch guns in the third conflict in as many decades.
We called New Jersey in several times. When you hear one of those rounds go overhead, it's pretty awesome. It makes it sound like woof, 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 going over. And puts a pretty bit of hole in the ground.
We got to use, I think it was the guns of the New Jersey, and the most accurate artillery that I've ever seen. You call in your coordinates and a fire mission and maybe one marking round, maybe two, and it's fire for effect. And it was just incredible how accurate those guns were.
As they had been in World War II and the Korean War, ships of the U.S. Navy were also called upon to support the amphibious landing of ground forces. In many ways, amphibious operations had changed little since World War II, but in Vietnam, an important new dimension was added. The concept of vertical envelopment, the use of helicopters, enabled the Marines to land quickly well behind the enemy's beach defenses.
We were signed, I think, 6 of us to a chopper, or 8, I can't remember exactly, and we'd go up to the flight deck and get in the ready room, the chopper would land, and we ran out, and I'd never been on a helicopter in my life. And this was the first operation I'd ever been on. We flew in country. I didn't know where the hell we were going. Nobody knew where we were going, and I didn't know what to expect being a new guy. The chopper didn't exactly land on the ground, hovered a couple of feet, and they told us to get the hell out.
The successful deployment of troops in this way, supplemented by conventionally delivered forces over the beach, took U.S. Navy amphibious operations to a new level of complexity. Throughout Vietnam, there were extensive waterways that could not be reached or controlled with the conventional methods of the U.S. Navy. With both sides dependent on the inland waterways for transportation, the Navy turned to local resources and expertise. The first fruit of these efforts was the junk force. These were small, locally built boats, crewed by local sailors and advised by U.S. Navy personnel. They became a fairly effective means of controlling the inland waterways during daylight hours. Where the junks lacked the ability to move far from the main waterways, units of smaller craft were established, crewed by mercenaries hired and advised by Americans to operate in shallow or confined waters. The craft of choice was the familiar airboat, adapted to military purposes.
Every once in a while, we'd work with the B team. The airboats were down on our B team. So they'd come up at Mukwa, and they'd come up every once in a while, and we'd work with them. I didn't particularly like them because you can only put 3 guys in each boat. The engine was a 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney, and you couldn't hear nothing. The only way you knew you were getting shot at is some guy would fall down or you get holes in the boat. But other than that, of course the bad thing was they burned aviation fuel, which was highly volatile, and they'd store it right outside the camp. We'd always appreciated that.
These small craft, manned by their polyglot crews, skimmed along the canals and grassy swamps of the Mekong Delta, attempting to hamper guerrilla operations and movements.
One day we were topside, and there was a whole bunch of these airboats coming down the river, and they came by us, they were flying the skull and crossbones. Had no idea what this is all about, and then this was over up close to Cambodia, and they started circling our boat and radioed for permission to come on board. And I went back to my storeroom, and these guys had requested to get supplies. I went and buy some supplies from them, so they sent them back to me, and this guy came, it's the most emaciated, scary-looking individual I think I've ever seen in my life. He was a mercenary, and they got paid by the ears that they produced, pairs of ears.
Although fairly successful, these early Vietnamese efforts lacked the resources and technology to adequately control the areas they were being called upon to patrol. As a result, The U.S. Navy's presence grew throughout the inland waterways as swift boats and PBRs took American sailors into ever shallower and more confined waters. Far from Yankee Station and the other conventional applications of sea power, sailors of the United States Navy were serving aboard a new kind of warship, the patrol hovercraft. Riding on a cushion of air, the hovercraft swept along effortlessly over the marshy terrain. Armed with several machine guns, the hovercraft could bring fire to bear on any enemy found.
The one Nixon does had a minigun mounted on the front. A minigun mounted on a water or a land craft is mean, you know, and they had enough horsepower to carry plenty of ammunition with it, so.
As useful as the hovercraft were, their limitations meant that further innovation was needed. This led to the River Patrol Boat, or PBR, specially converted for combat in the Mekong Delta. Each unarmored fiberglass boat had a crew of 4 men, a commander, a helmsman, a forward machine gunner with twin 50 caliber machine guns, and a rear gunner with a combination 50 caliber and 40 millimeter grenade launcher. Drawing only 18 inches of water and capable of speeds up to 25 knots, the PBRs could go almost anywhere.
They had a water induction engine on them. You suck water in the front, blow it out the back. And of course, the thing would invariably get full of weeds at the wrong time in the wrong place. So we'd all jump over the side to try to clear the front of it. But they were excellent.
We got to go out on rides with them. I did a couple of rides on there, but I always told the guys that if those people had done more duck hunting, they'd have killed a lot more of our sailors, but they didn't know how to lead the boats. They'd shoot at you and see the tracers curve behind you or go behind you all the time. And that was lucky for our side.
The versatile PBRs were stationed throughout Vietnam and were used to check local traffic in the same way their larger cousins, the swift boats, did in less confined waters. Where a secure camp was not available, the boats were based in the rivers themselves on special barges that housed the crews and supported the boats with supplies and maintenance.
The YRBM was about 400 feet long, maybe not that big. The aft portion of the YRBM 20 was all machine shops, and they had huge South Bend lathes. They could make anything. I mean, if we didn't have the part, we couldn't get the part in time from Saigon, then they'd build the part back there. It was a very skilled neighborhood carpenters and mates, electricians, ship fitters, everything to repair the boats and the helicopters at that time.
Control of these far-flung operations was vested in command posts that coordinated operations in the Delta area. From here, patrol boats were sent out in random patterns to keep the enemy guessing.
The PBRs had a huge task to do. Their job was basically to board as much watercraft as they could in a day, and there's hundreds of sandpans in the Delta, from small 12-foot 1- and 2-person ones up to these water taxis that would have 40, 50 people on them. If they had a load of melons, they'd have to basically unload a lot of those things, look in the bottom of them, search the rice, check all the papers, and make sure that their papers were in order for all the citizens.
Generally, these patrols found nothing but innocent locals. But occasionally, the fast little boats might round a bend and catch sight of something suspicious.
Warden X-ray 1, this is Warden X-ray. I have sampan crossing up ahead. Break, I will...
Closing rapidly, warning shots were fired to signal the craft to halt.
Warden X-ray 1, this is Warden X-ray. One sampan evaded to the beach. 2 male occupants abandoned a sampan, headed up the beach. Taken area under fire. We'll amplify later. Over.
This is Warden 1, roger that.
Warden X-ray receiving heavy automatic weapons fire, vicinity of evasion. Request
This is Warden 1, roger out. Steel Base 3, this is Warden, scramble Seawolves.
Flying off specially modified LSTs, barges, and fire bases, the Sea Wolves, a U.S. Navy helicopter gunship unit, could respond quickly to any contact report.
The Sea Wolves were absolutely some of the best pilots, or Marine and Navy pilots, and when they came in, they were right on the deck. I mean, they were 20 to 30 feet off the ground and come right over our troops and fire the rockets into the enemy and get them back. They were a great bunch.
While artillery or airstrikes could also be utilized, the application of this kind of firepower usually caused the enemy to melt away to wait for better odds to strike. As essential as the daylight patrols were, it was when the sun set that the PBRs truly earned their reputation. Ed Gear, an Army major operating in the RUMSAT, worked with and relied on the PBRs that prowled the darkness.
If we could prevent them from moving around at night, then they really couldn't use the area because they couldn't move in the daytime because we had aerial surveillance over it.
Navy and the PBRs fascinated me because I asked them one time, what do you guys do? And he said, well, most of the time we drive up and down the river, and when we get shot at, we shoot back. I says, that isn't much of a plan. If I was going to, I wouldn't leave the front gate if my plan was to go out and get shot at first.
The tactic we used was that instead of us trying to root them out of the mangrove swamps, we would just find places in the stream flow, and we would set up ambushes at night in those locations. And of course, we had the equipment that they didn't have. We had the starlight scopes and things of that nature, and so it was really pretty easy for us to operate in that area. We had outboard motor boat that we would put half a dozen soldiers in it, and ammunition and weapons and all of that, and they would then go to a intersection, let's say, of two of these streams where they came together, and they would set up on maybe a mangrove tree in the area, staying with their boat. And they would be the point of contact, just a little 5 or 6 person group. And then if the VC coming through were small enough that they could attack them, then they would do so. If they weren't, then we had some PBRs that had heavier firepower that was a part of the Navy, Brownwater Navy that was working with us. And if we needed them, they were strategically located around the area and could come to the assistance of one of these small ambushes very rapidly.
PBR sailors were incredibly brave individuals and never seemed to back away from firefights. Of course, we had people in there they knew they were going to go in and help, but I remember watching a firefight from a distance at night one time, and it was just intense. It was just a hell of a battle going on, and our tracers were a yellow color, white to yellow, if I remember, and theirs were red and blue, and there was so much fire going towards each other that the bullets were colliding and ricocheting off things and forming a fountain of this. And remember, only every 5th bullet's a tracer. So it's just this red and blue fountain and white fountain coming out of this area, and the intensity that was going on was incredible.
Then if that wasn't enough, again, we had both Air Force and Navy Air that had night fighting capability that were under our direct operational control.
PBR activities, to be most effective, had to be based on accurate intelligence. One reason the Navy had such good intelligence in the Mekong Delta can be summed up in 2 words: SEAL teams. The exploits of the SEAL teams has been elevated to legend in some instances, but whatever has been said, the fact remains that they were incredibly effective at meeting the enemy on his own ground.
was interesting working with the SEALs and the equipment they had, so specialized, and they used Stoner rifles and Stoner machine guns, which were just so much more reliable than the ones we were using, and high-tech. Well, actually, I don't know if the Stoners were that much more reliable because they had to go to a special school just to learn to operate them. They had assault boats, which were designed for them. They were a 30-foot metal-clad, low-profile ski boat-looking situation with twin Ford 427 Interceptor engines and jacuzzi pumps on them. Could just get out and flat move in a hurry, which they had to do quite often, I guess.
SEAL teams prepared for their missions in every way possible and were some of the only American forces to continue rigorous physical training while in base camp between missions. This fact, combined with constant briefings, kept the SEALs at peak efficiency. Whether slipping ashore from a small boat or put in by a larger landing craft, which would stop at several places to deceive the enemy and obscure the patrol's real location, the patrol usually used stealth and field craft to track and gather intelligence on their elusive foe.
I think we like to think of the SEALs being 6'9" and, you know, all look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Most of the SEALs were smaller stature. I'd say that they had a 5'4" to 5'9". Wiry guys, tough as nails. I mean, they could run for 20 miles and hardly take a breath. I mean, they were great. Their operations were mostly recon. Sometimes they were set out to assassinate certain chieftains and villages. Quite often went out in black pajamas, but using Chi-Com weapons, and would just infiltrate different areas.
Unlike most American forces in Vietnam, the SEAL teams were able to operate and use the night to actually meet the enemy on his own ground and his own terrain. And the SEALs were very effective, especially in the Delta area and the areas around the rivers in South Vietnam.
Once the patrol had accomplished its mission, they would generally move back to a canal, set up a perimeter, often setting booby traps or charges for unwelcome visitors. Soon, a Navy landing craft would arrive and retrieve the small team. Hours or days of tension washed away as the team relaxed on the relatively safe haven of the Navy landing craft and returned to base. There they were debriefed by the team leader on the completed mission, and the intelligence gathered was passed on. Often the debriefing officers might make an aerial reconnaissance over the area in a helicopter to see if larger unit operations could be conducted to go after the enemy forces identified by the SEAL team. The Army and Navy combined to form an effective answer to the question of how to place and support a force large enough to take on the enemy in the formidable terrain of the Delta. This unit was known as the Riverine Force and was designed specifically for the conditions encountered in Vietnam. The swamps and mangrove tangles of the Mekong Delta that made it difficult for conventional forces to operate led to the development of the Joint River Assault Group. This was the ultimate extension of the fleet in the inland waters and was truly the backbone of the Brown Water Navy.
One of the most remarkable and successful innovations that occurs in the Vietnam War is the formation of the Joint Riverine Force, which is the Army and the Navy cooperating and working together to effectively meet the enemy in the Mekong Delta area with both river and ground forces. And this success and the idea of the services working together in a joint way is one of the lessons that the military will carry forward from Vietnam and learn from, and the highlight and begin to really emphasize the use of joint operations.
The Navy component consisted of a number of specially modified craft built to perform the role of larger ships during these inland amphibious operations. The battleships of the Inland Navy were the LCM gunboats, or monitors. These specialized vessels were armored and designed for one purpose: to close in to shore and fight it out with the enemy.
We had three. One of them was called a zip boat, had flamethrowers mounted on both sides. The other one had a minigun mounted on it, And the other one mounted a 105 to use to put beehive rounds in. But the good thing was a lot of firepower.
The river monitors were responsible for screening the landing of the infantry and then supporting the operations of the troops ashore. The least glamorous of the inland fleet were the armored troop carriers that delivered the waterborne infantry to the battle area. Armed only for defense, their role was to deliver the troops, provide supplies, and retrieve the soldiers when the operation was over.
You'd be going down these rivers, one boat after the next, wagon train style, with dense forest on both sides, just feet away. Then, well, there was a couple times, of course, on that where you can say all hell broke loose. And it's deafening, the amount of firepower put out by the Navy.
The Army was represented by the 9th Infantry Division, which operated from a floating base camp in the river.
Our battalion moved from Dongtam onto the Mobile Riverine Force, onto the ships in the middle of the Mekong River. And that was the elite place to be, because you had all the water you wanted. You had it hot or cold. The Navy cooks would decorate the food. You know, you go through there, the best food and all the milk you wanted. It was like we felt bad for the guys on land because they didn't have all the supplies that we had.
We did joint operations with the 9th Infantry, and actually we had operations that we took people in on with landing craft. We had the Popular Forces, which was the local armies like a militia, and 9th Army. And the SEALs would do the recon, set up the ambush, and they'd do an old hammer and anvil trick and try to push the VC into a spot, and then they'd use the RAG fleet, the monitors and stuff with the tank turrets for their artillery base, mobile artillery, and they try to force the VC down into those things and block them off.
These operations could last hours or days as the boats of the Brownwater Navy stood by in support. At the completion of an operation, the boats would move into a predetermined location and wait for the assault force to slog out and rejoin the boats. Downriver, they would unload at their floating base and be checked aboard and prepared to go out again. In addition to operations with the 9th Infantry Division, the Riverine Force was also utilized to assist other units, including Special Forces and the indigenous soldiers they led.
They saved us one time. We were surrounded, had nowhere to go, and the next morning the boats had come in and parked by the river, so we took off at them, and they were firing, they had 40 millimeter and 20 millimeter guns on there, and they were shooting right over our head. And to this day, I will buy a sailor a beer if I can. We get on that boat, I was stepping on my tongue, and the chief of the boat said, you know what you need? I said, no, what do I need? He said, you need a cold beer. I said, do you guys have beer on this boat? He said, yep, only Navy vessel allowed to carry beer.
As the American involvement in Vietnam wound down in the early 1970s, more and more of the Navy's small boat and coastal operations became part of the Vietnamization process. In this period, American sailors turned over their boats and the bases that supported them to the South Vietnamese.
There was this transition period where the Vietnamese were riding the boats with us or being on watch with us, and then we were slowly turning that responsibility over so that we would do most of the activity, and then a month later maybe the Vietnamese were doing most of the activity where we were just coaching them.
Shortly after I left country, they were turning over our patrol boats to the Vietnamese Navy, and I think that was kind of the beginning of the end. But fighting boats. My friends John Purley sent me a picture of one of the boats with that had been a fighting boat and was coming by with a Vietnamese crew and had laundry hanging between the antennas and chickens running around on the deck, and it didn't quite look the same.
Naval operations, increasingly carried out by the Vietnamese toward the end of America's commitment to the war in Vietnam, represented some of the most successful innovations made to adapt to the situation and terrain of Vietnam. Adaptation was the byword of the U.S. Navy's involvement during the long and brutal war in Southeast Asia. It was the ability of the U.S. Navy to successfully adapt to unfamiliar circumstances that marked naval operations during the Vietnam War.
We did it to the best of our ability. It was an 18-hour day job. You're lucky to squeeze in 6 hours to sleep. You went 75 days without a beer at times. But it was our job. We loved our country. We loved our job. We loved our Navy.
There's a special sense of dedication and honor and camaraderie and community and everything else that takes place, and I think people are envious of that.
We were actually there to try to preserve freedom for those people, and they were worth it.